I've always trusted doctors. I assumed he would take his oath and do no harm. It was the 6th month after surgery before I realized this man has been dragging me along and lying to me. This man has done something seriously wrong, and he's been lying to me. That's what I felt. I remember being completely terrified and horrified of what my future life was going to be. Oh my God, am I bedridden for the rest of my life? How do I take care of my wife and kids? I walked into this hospital and I never walked out.
Anyone close to me thinks that I'm likely something between God, Einstein, and the Antichrist. I'm ready to become a cold-blooded killer. This is not just a doctor having bad days here and there. This is somebody who very serially is injuring people. And so it does make you question, was he doing this on purpose? Does he want to harm patients? Is he using this as a tool for some sort of pleasure that he's bringing himself?
Something you hear about in the movies. The guy comes in, sweeps you off your feet, everything's gonna change for the better. It's hard to believe that that is the same man. It's just that knowing Chris personally, I don't feel like he was a murderer. It breaks my heart that this is what this came to. That's what's heartbreaking. And no matter how bad you wish you could change the past, you cannot. I haven't cried about it in a long time. So I thought that was like done with about crying, but it's not. I've buried it all up until this point. I guess when you start digging, it's gonna dig up emotions because nothing about it is happy. Nothing. Maybe the beginning, but that is it. First time I met Chris was at a strip club in Memphis. I was an exotic dancer. I was drinking an Appletini, just, hanging out with a friend. And he introduced himself as Dr. Christopher Dench. He was very sure of himself. He was very charming. He could walk into the room and take over the whole room. And we hit it off pretty good and ended up going back to his house. He had his science award. He had his PhDs on the wall. And so when you see that, you're like, whoa, The disco ball was hanging in the corner of his office. First, I was like, why do you have a disco ball in your room? We drank a little bit, and then we were dancing under the disco ball in his office, listening to music. So I just thought this is a dream. Who wouldn't love this? Within that first week, I ended up pregnant. It was always something that I wanted, was to become a mom and have the family, the normal, the house, the car, the family, picture perfect. This is like fairy tale. It's something you hear about in the movies, the guy comes in, sweeps you off your feet, everything's gonna change for the better. I think I just relied too much on that. And I probably shouldn't have, but I did.
walk properly, can't write properly. I'm maybe 10% of the man I used to be. Maybe 10%. I've been a mechanic really since I was 17. I enjoyed what I did. Enjoyed the people I worked with. I made more than enough money to keep a roof over our head and food in our belly and clothes on our back and all that good stuff. After many years of the pain and finally coming to the conclusion that I had to do something about it, I went to my insurance carrier's website and found a neurosurgeon that was in network. And there was a nice write-up about Dr. Duntsch. And I went to his website, and his website talked about all the great things he had done, and how brilliant he was. And so I said, well, okay, let's give him a call and set up an appointment. And that's what I did.
My approach to patient care is I treat all patients non-surgically at first, if at all possible.
He was pleasant. He liked to describe everything he had done medically and how proud he was of himself. He seemed to, a little arrogant, but I expected that from a neurosurgeon. He said it was a very common surgery to fix it. Hundreds, if not thousands of them are done every day without any problems. When you're in that much pain and somebody tells you that the surgery is going to take 100% of it away, you can't help but say, please, let's do this. When I get there, the nurses are taking all my vitals, getting the IV started. This was the first time I'd ever had surgery in my life. I was extremely nervous, extremely scared. The only thing I kept telling myself is, Jeff, quit being a baby, quit being a scaredy cat, whatever. But I still hadn't seen Dr. Duntsch. He never came by to see me, and he didn't come in and see me before they put me to sleep, which I thought was strange. I really just remember staring up at the ceiling and praying. I was just praying, God, please let it go well. Guide his hands, make sure this turns out well.
I think of all of the cases that I've ever done, this one stays with me the most. The first time that the DA's office heard about the Duntsch case was very early on. There actually had already been some civil lawsuits filed. They were trying to say, what he's doing is criminal, he's hurting people, we need help stopping him. We decided we needed to know every single patient that Duntsch had operated on while he was in Dallas. He operated on 38 total patients. And as I began to look through their files, we realized, oh, wow, he has injured most of them. Ultimately, I think what I figured out is that 33 out of 38 patients were injured by Christopher Duntsch. I don't think you can look at that number of 33 out of 38 patients being injured without being appalled by it, without being shocked. This is something that should at least be looked into, not ignored. It seems like there needs to be a real investigation done here.
When I met Chris, he swept me off my feet pretty much. It just was like unimaginable. It was more like a dream. I felt like he came in and he was like, everything that I didn't have before, like everything that I've always wanted would happen. I was very excited. It's gonna be a great life. He loved it, he was excited. Who wouldn't be though? It's like your whole world just opened up. You're out of grad school, going into one of the biggest hospitals in Dallas, Plano area. He was excited, very excited. When we first moved to Dallas and Chris started his job at the hospital, I would get up and make coffee for him to get him ready to go out the door. He was already up at like 5:30, going through files, going through charts, looking at x-rays. Chris's dreams was to become the best surgeon in Dallas. I thought, everything was going well for him. But once, he hired his nurse, everything changed. I'd never seen him, per se, party with the drugs. I didn't, see the alcohol. There were nights where him and the assistant would go out, and they wouldn't get home until 2, 3 in the morning, sometimes not at all. One night in particular, I remember being up kind of late and kind of upset with him. I look out the window when they pull into the drive. They're loud, they're drunk. And then I saw his assistant kiss Chris. And that's when I knew. I was really upset. He took me away from the world that I knew, the world I was comfortable in, put me in this new world, and then kind of like let me hang out there. I had nothing else that I could do. I was pregnant. I can't go back to my old life. I mean, what was I supposed to do?
Pain. When I woke up in recovery, I was in so much pain. I practically started crying. I was on the verge of tears, yes. It was a horrible pain. I was thinking I was gonna die. I didn't know why the pain should be so rough until just a few minutes later when Dr. Dunch came in and he said, "Okay, Jeff, wiggle your toes." And I could only wiggle the toes on my left foot. I was like, God, that's not good. And he said, "Okay, wiggle your fingers." And so I noticed that I couldn't move my right hand. Oh my God, me. Am I bedridden for the rest of my life? How do I take care of my wife and kids? I remember being completely terrified and horrified of what my future life was going to be. See, at first, of course, I thought I was going to be going home. But now that I'm paralyzed from the neck down on my right side, I'm not going anywhere. I walked into this hospital, and I never walked out.
I don't think we knew whether it was criminal or not. Is this just a malpractice kind of thing going on, or have we stepped into the realm of somebody who is maliciously hurting people? We looked into his background a little bit, and he had come out of the University of Tennessee, which is a very good school. He trained under one of the best physicians out there in spine surgery. He graduated with honors. His resume is fantastic. He did a lot of research. And so, on paper, he looks really good. Really makes you question more, how did we get where we're at? This is much bigger than I had originally expected. Almost every single person that he puts under the knife, he is doing something wrong. And so it does make you question, was he doing this on purpose? Does he want to harm patients? Is he using this as a tool for some sort of pleasure that he's bringing himself? This is not just a doctor having bad days here and there. This is somebody who very serially is injuring people.
I've always trusted doctors. He had the PhD. I knew he was smart. I knew he was actually a neurosurgeon. And I assumed he would take his oath and do no harm. He told me that it was a bruising of the spinal cord. It's going to take it a while to, just the swelling to go down, but once it does, you're going to be 100%, just like you were. He told me it would take probably about 4 weeks. Approximately 4 weeks, I would be back to 100%. But every follow-up I went to, he added more time to it. Jeff, it's going to be 3 months. It was the 6th month after surgery before I realized this man has been dragging me along and lying to me. This man has done something seriously wrong, and he's been lying to me. That's what I felt. When I went to my 6-month follow-up, I said, I want all my records. I want my MRIs. I want my x-rays. I said, I've got to go see somebody for a second opinion. I said, you've been telling me, visit after visit, Jeff, you're going to be good by the next visit. And it never happens. Well, other people may say some bad things about these MRIs. I said, what? He got up to leave and he grabbed all the MRIs and x-rays and started to walk out with them. I mean, I was so shocked, I just immediately stood up as fast as I could, which isn't very fast, but I stood up as fast as I could and reached as far as I could, and I pulled them back and said, no, sir, those are mine. And he stepped back into the hallway, went out the door and left. On the way home, I'm nervous because of the way it ended, because I knew that if he wanted those records back as bad as he did, there was probably something seriously wrong inside, and I needed to find out. At that point, I knew I had made a huge mistake. Pretty much knew I'd made a huge mistake.
He's like, what are they going to say in the medical society? You're pregnant, we're not married, you're a stripper. It'll make me look bad. I was like, I don't even know who you are. That's when I realized that I should be digging it a little bit more to find some answers. I want to know, what is it that I'm living in? I looked through the computer history. I looked through the cell phone. That's when I found the email. My medical records were accessed from my OBGYN, and somebody requested my record to get me transferred to a hospital in Denver, which is where Chris's parents live. And then that's when I realized, oh, Chris is trying to send me to live with his parents so I can have the baby. And I was like, okay, I see what's going on here. Yeah, you're completely trying to move me out of the life you just gave me. I was disgusted and furious, and the more I dug, the more I found, the more I hated. I thought it was going to be a good life, but it wasn't.
He'd been able to get away with killing people. He'd been able to get away with making somebody a quadriplegic and hadn't really suffered any consequences from any of that. How does somebody cause so much damage? That really became a big question. We saw that he kept moving from location to location. He was moving the hospitals that he was actually working and doing his surgeries at. We were able to figure out, well, he's getting kicked out of these hospitals. They won't let him, practice there anymore. Some of the stories that we heard were that he would show up and he would be sweating profusely and his eyes would be dilated. That maybe gave them some concerns about whether he was on any drugs at the time. Duntsch himself had indicated that he used neurostimulants before surgeries, and of course that would be something like cocaine. There's no real way nationwide or worldwide to prevent somebody like this from just going somewhere else and continuing to practice. So the only way to do that was to give him a criminal conviction that anybody could see.
A few months later, I finally got to see another doctor, and he told me what had really happened inside. And I was devastated, to say the least. He said there's no surgery that can correct a torn spinal cord or cut open spinal cord. My heart fell to my stomach. I had no idea that my spinal cord had been cut. He literally brought it up on his computer and showed me where my spinal cord had been cut open. He said something to me that I have not forgotten to this day. He said, "I'm sorry, Jeff. You are what you are." I just couldn't believe it. I was heartbroken. I was scared again, because now I know that I'm not going to get back to 100%. I just felt like my world was coming to an end. And that's when I started crying. I cried right there in his office. He hung his head in shame. He said he was embarrassed that Dr. Duntsch was in the same profession he was. And he also told me about how Dr. Duntsch has many patients that have had bad outcomes. And he had already been trying to work on some patients to see if he could help them out. When I found that out, it literally sent shivers down my spine. My goosebumps came up on my arm. I said, this is not right. He should not have still been practicing when he got to me. So I was mad that there was this many people already hurt and that he was still allowed to be a neurosurgeon. It made me think that this was deliberate, that these weren't accidents. This is probably not malpractice. This is more than likely a sick, evil, twisted individual who somehow made it through med school.
When I arrived home after having my oldest son, all of my clothes from my master bedroom had been moved into the guest bedroom. I am feeling so many emotions at this time. I was angry, I was sad. I've been alienated from everyone that I've known, anything that I've known. I became totally dependent on him at this time. I'm in this situation. I don't really see how an easy out right now. I really don't. My world was just kind of falling apart. One of the days I was going to drive Chris to surgery, we go outside to find that our vehicle had been taken apart. There was no tires on it. The drive shaft had been broken. That freaked me out. I was like, why would somebody do that? He was pretty upset. He was like, I don't know who would have done this. Another incident, there was a phone call of someone saying something to the effect of, are you ready to die?
Excuse me?
I'm like, who is this? And I couldn't get them to give me their name. And I'm just like, what in the world is going on? This is out of control. Obviously, there's something going on. I don't know exactly what that is, but I'm sure it's going to reveal itself, and I don't want any part of it. I almost instantly got my stuff together and I moved out.
I had to tell my boss. I had to tell him the truth. I'd been telling him all along that I was going to be better, that my spinal cord was going to get better and I would be able to go back to work. So I just had to tell him the truth. I started crying. I said, that guy's been lying to me for 6 months. I said, I am what I am. I said, this is it. It's not going to get any better. I'm not going to be able to climb those ladders. I'm not going to be able to carry that 25-pound tool bag up and down those stairs. It's just not going to happen. I'm not going to be able to do this. Oh, it was terrible. It was the best job I ever had.
By the time he got to Mary Eford, he had just killed 2 people, and there were a couple of other patients where he knew he had hurt them. And so he would have known that he was going to hurt her and therefore never should have done the surgery at all. The day before, Dr. Junch had operated on a different patient who was not doing well. She ended up having a stroke and wasn't getting enough blood to her brain. And so really, he should have been treating her. Instead, he decides to go into Mary Eford surgery. He cut off one of her nerve roots. He put a screw through a different nerve, which caused her just excruciating pain. He also put the implant device in her muscle instead of the bone. He kept drilling over and over again, so there are multiple holes in her muscles. One doctor described it to me as trying to put screws into raw tuna. Everybody in the operating room was telling him that he did not have the device in the correct spot, and he wouldn't listen to them. None of these things should ever happen in a surgery, not in a surgeon's entire lifetime. Because it was an injury to an elderly, the jury would be able to consider all the way up to a life sentence. It was important to us that he never be able to operate again, and a life sentence, of course, would prevent that forever.
basically, the reason you're here right now today, okay, is you have been charged with aggravated assault, okay, and 1 count of injury to elderly.
Yeah, I know this was going on. I actually planned to bring all my documents to the DA directly.
Oh, did you?
And let him have everything so that they would have full disclosure, because I know exactly what's happened, and none of it is criminal.
Okay.
I know what they're alleging, and none of it's true. It's easy defendable.
I think his ego is large enough that he thought he could talk his way out of it. I don't think he was processing the fact that he was about to spend some quality time in the Dallas County Jail for these charges.
Let's talk about Jeffrey Chaney. You remember that surgery?
Yes. The surgery went fine, and there's no real explanation for why they happen in surgery. Part of the time, it's on his consent form. They expect that's possible. So I kept him in the hospital for 2 or 3 days, and then I put him in rehabilitation. He recovered 95% and he went back to work. Yeah, absolutely.
He seems to, in some ways, live in his own world, and that reality does not align with what actually had happened to the patients. The reality of it is that Mr. Chaney has had his spinal cord partially cut, and he can't feel half of his body, and that he's never going to be better.
He recovered very rapidly, got most of it back. He was able to go back to work and have a normal career.
I think he has mental health issues, right? I think he's a narcissist and probably a sociopath, unable to recognize that he was the one actually causing the damage. It was always everybody else's fault. And I think that's very scary. It's definitely not the kind of person that you want being a doctor, sticking, a scalpel into your back and opening you up.
Hello?
I hadn't heard until one of my girlfriends that I used to work with called me and was like, "Hey, are you okay? I heard your son's dad's on the news for abusing an elderly lady." I was just blown away. It all kind of came crashing to a reality. It was just very much of a shock. Chris very much kept me from the medical side as much as he could for as long as he could. I had no idea. I believe the phone call that we received that was a death threat was from a patient's family member. Looking back on it, I'm thinking maybe somebody did it to keep him from going to surgery.
That he's the kind of person who can do anything that he wants. And that's kind of what his behavior was. He began to do whatever he felt like, ignoring any of the consequences. We ultimately decided that this was just more information for the jury to consider.
I did not believe for a minute that they were really going to be able to pull this off. I was pretty sure he was going to walk. It doesn't bother him at all. He did not look disturbed one bit. I'm sure he still thought he was going to wind up walking on it. Sure, he didn't think he would be the first guy in Texas or possibly the United States to be busted for what he did in the operating room.
We, the jury, having found the defendant, Christopher Daniel Dutch, guilty of injury to an elderly individual as charged in the indictment.
It wasn't until that jury came back in with the verdict that I felt good about the whole situation. Guilty. And you're like, oh, okay. We're finally seeing justice. And I'm sure all those other families are feeling the same way.
I've always wondered what the motivation is here. I think that there are a lot of factors that played into it. I think he was very greedy and had big dreams in his head of, how much money he was going to make. I think he had addiction issues. Right? I believe that he did a lot of drugs and alcohol. And so I just think all of that really added up to somebody who continued to operate on patients despite the fact that he was hurting them. He didn't care. I felt like the patients needed somebody to stand up for them. You can't ever forget their stories. They haunt you. I don't think that you can investigate a case like this and not become a little bit emotionally invested, because you become tied to the patients and they're relying on you to bring them justice. And they finally won. They finally got their justice.
I don't think that there's ever really been a time that we've sat down and talked about it. He just said, I didn't do those things, not what they say I am. He's almost unrecognizable. It's hard to believe that it's the same man. Maybe he didn't know what he was doing and he didn't know how to say, I messed up, or it was an accident. It's just that knowing Chris personally, I don't feel like he was a murderer. I don't know what he deserves. Yeah, I get every action has a consequence, but maybe, not life in prison. Life is a long time. And when we go to visit Chris, it's very emotional. My son knows that, it's actual prison. If you do bad, then that's where you go.
He wants to go today. And when I say I can't stay, but I promise you very soon, he's like, right now. And then he starts telling her never to get out.
I know he feels sorry. I know he's regretful. I know he's sorrowful. But we can't change anything. So it hurts. It breaks my heart that this is what it came to. This is reality. That's what's heartbreaking. And no matter how bad you wish you could change the past, you cannot.
I'm permanently disabled. My two oldest daughters had children, and I couldn't pick up and hold my grandchildren in my arms. The grandson is the 9-year-old, and he's just like, Papa, can you throw the football with me out in the backyard? There was anger. There was severe anger. And it gave me bad thoughts and stuff. For some reason, it dawned on me, Jeff, you're holding in this anger and hatred. All you're doing is hurting yourself. I was finally like, he's where.
The bright studio lights of a live reality television broadcast are supposed to manufacture drama, but tonight, they're about to expose a monster. It is a Tuesday evening in prime time, millions of screens flicking in living rooms across the nation, cameras rolling, the studio audience holding its breath as the charismatic host prepares to reveal the grand finale of a high-stakes home renovation show. The charismatic contractor, a beloved community figure with a silver fox smile and an unblemished reputation, stands center stage, waving to his adoring fans, completely unaware that the heavy steel doors of the soundstage are being quietly locked from the outside. In the shadows just beyond the perimeter of the glaring stage lights, tactical gear rustles, heavy combat boots step silently over thick television cables, and the cold metal of real handcuffs catches the studio reflection. This is not a planned twist for ratings. This is not a scripted cliffhanger. This is the sudden, violent collision of modern entertainment and a dark, decaying secret buried 33 years ago in the frozen soil of a Detroit winter. The cameras zoom in on the host, whose smile suddenly freezes as an unexpected earpiece transmission changes the course of television history, shifting the scene from a celebratory showcase to a live, nationwide execution of justice. The crowd gasps as armed federal agents and Detroit homicide detectives break through the wings, swarming the stage, blocking the exits, and pinning the beloved star to the pristine floor before he can even process the betrayal of the cameras he loved so much. A cold case left to rot in the filing cabinets of the Michigan Police Department since 1993 has just exploded into the present day, shattering the illusion of a perfect life and proving that no matter how deep you bury the body, the past always finds a way to broadcast its revenge. 33 years prior to this televised ambush, the city of Detroit was a sprawling landscape of industrial decay and biting, merciless wind, a place where secrets could easily disappear into the smoke of the factories and the gray, relentless overcast of late November. In 1993, the neighborhood of Palmer Woods was an affluent pocket of historic brick homes, towering oak trees, and quiet, wealthy residents who believed their money could insulate them from the escalating violence of the inner city. It was inside one of these pristine Tudor mansions that Clara Vance, a 32-year-old rising star in corporate finance, lived with her husband, Arthur Vance, an ambitious young real estate developer known for his charming demeanor and relentless drive. To the outside world, the Vances were the quintessential power couple of the new Detroit aristocracy, hosting charity galas, donating to local orphanages, and projecting an image of flawless marital bliss that made them the envy of their social circles. But behind the heavy mahogany doors and the stained glass windows, neighbors later recalled hearing the faint, muffled sounds of midnight arguments, bitter shouting matches that abruptly stopped whenever a porch light flicked on or a car drove down the quiet street. On the freezing night of November 14, 1993, a blinding blizzard swept across the Great Lakes, burying Detroit under 2 feet of heavy, impenetrable snow, cutting power lines, paralyzing transportation, and creating a whiteout cocoon that isolated Palmer Woods from the rest of the world. It was during this night of absolute isolation, when the wind howled like a dying animal through the rafters, that Clara Vance vanished from the face of the earth, leaving behind a perfectly set dining room table, a half-empty glass of red wine, and a house completely devoid of any signs of a struggle. When the first morning light cracked through the storm clouds on November 15th, Arthur Vance ran out into the snow-covered street, his clothes disheveled, his face twisted in a mask of sheer panic, screaming for the neighbors to call the police because his wife was gone. The responding officers found the young husband frantic, pacing the polished hardwood floors of the mansion, weeping openly as he explained that he had fallen asleep in the guest room after a minor disagreement over their holiday plans, only to wake up to an empty master bedroom. He pointed to the back door, which stood slightly ajar, a small drift of snow accumulating on the kitchen tile, suggesting that Clara had left the house on foot in the middle of a historic blizzard wearing nothing but her silk nightgown. Homicide detectives scrutinized the pristine kitchen, noting that Clara's purse, car keys, winter coat, and even her gold wedding ring were still sitting on the vanity, untouched, as if she had simply evaporated into the freezing air. Search and rescue teams were deployed into the blinding white landscape, their heavy flashlights cutting through the snowdrifts, tracking dogs sniffing frantically at the perimeter of the estate, but the bitter wind had already erased any footprints that might have existed, leaving no trail to follow. The community was paralyzed with fear, local news stations broadcasting urgent alerts about the missing socialite, while rumors spread like wildfire through the city that a phantom predator was stalking the wealthy enclaves of Detroit under the cover of the storm. As the days bled into weeks, the initial sympathy for the grieving husband began to sour into suspicion, as seasoned detectives noted inconsistencies in Arthur Vance's timeline and an unsettling lack of physical evidence supporting the theory of a midnight walk. Neighbors whispered about Arthur's sudden, cold efficiency in the days following the disappearance, observing him loading heavy industrial trash bags into his truck in the dead of night, his silhouette silhouetted against the garage lights. The lead detective on the case, a hardened veteran named Marcus Miller, felt a knot form in his stomach every time he interviewed Arthur, noting how the young developer's tears seemed to turn on and off like a faucet, depending on whether the cameras were rolling. Miller pushed for a forensic sweep of the mansion, but in 1993, luminol technology was rudimentary, and without a body, a crime scene, or a drop of blood, the legal system was powerless against a wealthy man who maintained his absolute innocence with chilling composure. Arthur Vance hired the most expensive defense attorneys in Michigan, men who successfully blocked further police interrogations, threatened harassment lawsuits against the department, and effectively tied the hands of the investigators who knew, in their guts, that a murder had taken place. Then, less than 6 months after his wife's mysterious disappearance, Arthur did the unthinkable. He sold the Palmer Woods mansion, liquidated all of Clara's assets, closed his business accounts, and vanished from Detroit entirely, leaving behind a cold case that would haunt the city for decades. For 33 long years, the file cabinet containing the case of Clara Vance sat in the dark basement of the Detroit Police Headquarters, gathering dust, a monument to a system failed by wealth and timing, classified as a permanent cold case. The world moved on, the technology evolved, the old detectives retired or passed away, and the memory of the beautiful financier who vanished in the blizzard became nothing more than a ghost story told by older residents of Palmer Woods. Meanwhile, across the country in sunny California, a charismatic, silver-haired real estate mogul named Arthur Pendleton was building a massive empire, reinventing himself as a visionary designer who specialized in restoring broken, abandoned historic properties. His infectious energy and rugged charm eventually caught the attention of television executives, who handed him his own reality TV show, a massive hit series called Restoring the Ruins, where he became a national celebrity, beloved for his philanthropic work and his seemingly transparent life. He married a younger woman, bought a sprawling estate in Malibu, and basked in the adulation of millions of viewers who saw him as the ultimate self-made man, a beacon of hope and redemption in a cynical world. He had completely erased Arthur Vance from existence, adopting a new name, a new history, and a new face through subtle cosmetic surgeries, confident that the ghost of 1993 was buried so deep under the concrete of the past that it could never rise to challenge him. But the wheels of justice, though agonizingly slow, never truly stopped turning, and the catalyst for Arthur's downfall came from a source he never could have anticipated: the unstoppable rise of genetic genealogy and the relentless obsession of a new generation of investigators. In 2025, a young forensic analyst in Detroit, reviewing old unsolved homicides, decided to run the DNA profiles of unidentified remains found in the mid-1990s through an advanced, international civilian database. Decades earlier, in the spring of 1994, the thawed waters of the Detroit River had washed up a heavily weighed-down industrial barrel containing partial human remains, but the decomposition was so advanced that identification was impossible at the time, and the body was buried in a nameless pauper's grave. The new DNA sequencing matched the remains perfectly to Clara Vance's surviving sister, providing the definitive, undeniable proof that Clara had not walked out into the snowstorm. She had been brutally murdered, dismembered, and dumped into the dark waters of the river. With the homicide investigation officially reopened, a special task force began peeling back the layers of Arthur Vance's disappearance, utilizing digital financial tracking, old Social Security records, and facial recognition software that analyzed the high-definition broadcasts of Restoring the Ruins. The digital match was flawless. The beloved reality television star Arthur Pendleton was, without a shadow of a doubt, the long-sought fugitive Arthur Vance, the man who had choked the life out of his wife while the city slept through a blizzard. The strategy to capture the fugitive was designed not just to ensure an arrest, but to maximize the psychological shock, preventing a man of his vast wealth and connections from fleeing the country or hiring a legal team to stall the process. The FBI and Detroit Homicide coordinated with the network executives under the guise of an emergency security detail, keeping the operation entirely secret from the production crew and the studio audience to ensure absolute surprise. As the live broadcast counted down to its final minutes, the tension backstage was palpable, tactical teams moving into position behind the velvet curtains, their weapons drawn, waiting for the precise cue when Arthur would be most vulnerable, trapped in the center of the stage with nowhere to run. When the host stepped forward, his face pale, and broke script to announce that the show was being interrupted by federal authorities, the confusion in Arthur's eyes lasted for only a fraction of a second before the reality of his past slammed into him like a freight train. The live feeds captured every agonizing frame of his transformation, the smooth, confident celebrity face instantly collapsing into the terrified, defeated expression of the killer from 1993 as the handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists. The studio audience screamed, the internet erupted in a frenzy of breaking news alerts, and millions of viewers watched in absolute shock as the illusion of the perfect man evaporated under the merciless glare of the television lights. The aftermath of the televised arrest sent shockwaves through the entire country, transforming the hit reality show into a true crime phenomenon overnight and forcing a horrified public to reckon with the fact that they had been welcoming a killer into their homes every week. In Detroit, the news brought an overwhelming wave of catharsis and grief to the surviving family and friends of Clara Vance, who had spent more than 3 decades wondering if her killer would ever face justice or if her memory would be lost to time. The subsequent trial became a media circus, with prosecutors presenting damning new forensic evidence, including microscopic traces of Clara's DNA found in the floorboards of the old Palmer Woods house, which had been preserved beneath layers of new carpet by subsequent owners. Arthur Vance, stripped of his wealth, his fame, and his carefully constructed identity, sat in the courtroom as a broken, elderly man, his silver hair unkempt, his eyes staring blankly at the floor as the horrific details of his crime were laid bare for the world to see. He was found guilty on all counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring that he would spend the remainder of his days in a cold, concrete cell, far away from the cameras and the adulation he had sacrificed his soul to achieve. The legacy of the Detroit 1993 cold case remains a chilling reminder of the darkness that can hide behind the most polished facades, a cautionary tale about the limits of human deception in an age where the past can always be digitally resurrected. The Palmer Woods mansion still stands, its historic brick walls silent sentinels to a crime that took 33 years to fully solve, a house that will forever be associated with the night the blizzard took Clara Vance and the night the television cameras brought her back. In the end, the spectacular arrest on live television was not just a victory for the justice system, but a profound testament to the endurance of truth, proving that no amount of time, no change of name, and no level of fame can ever truly wash the blood from a killer's hands. As the final credits rolled on Arthur Vance's public life, the lasting image remains that of a man trapped in the glare of his own ambition, exposed to the world not as a master creator, but as a ghost from a cold Detroit winter who finally ran out of places to hide. The blinding studio lights of that fateful live broadcast did more than just expose Arthur Vance. They ignited a forensic and psychological firestorm that forced investigators to completely reconstruct the lost timeline of November 1993. To understand how a man could commit an atrocious act of violence, wipe his hands clean, and walk into a glittering new life of fame, detectives had to return to the frozen ground where it all began. The file on Clara Vance, once a forgotten stack of yellowed paper inside the Detroit Police Headquarters, was now the most scrutinized document in America. Homicide detectives, armed with modern digital technology, behavioral profiling, and a mountain of archived bank records, began a relentless descent into the dark winter of 33 years ago, peeling back the layers of deception to uncover exactly what happened in the suffocating silence of the Palmer Woods mansion. They needed to know not just how Clara died, but how Arthur managed to slip through the dragnet of a massive citywide investigation, leaving behind a community paralyzed by fear and a police department blinded by a masterfully orchestrated smokescreen. The investigation's expansion began with a deep, microscopic dive into the financial and personal dynamics of the Vance household leading up to the night of November 14, 1993. Clara Vance was not just a victim. She was an incredibly sharp, fiercely independent corporate financier who had begun to notice massive, unexplained discrepancies in her husband's real estate development accounts. Unbeknownst to their high society friends who saw them as the golden couple of Detroit, Arthur's ambitious empire was built on a volatile foundation of predatory loans, forged signatures, and embezzled corporate funds. Archival bank records recovered by the Modern Task Force revealed that just 3 days before her disappearance, Clara had initiated a private forensic audit of their joint assets, preparing to present the evidence of Arthur's massive fraud to a federal grand jury. She was planning to leave him, to strip him of the unearned prestige and wealth he worshipped above all else. In the hyper-competitive, image-obsessed mind of Arthur Vance, the threat of public ruin and financial bankruptcy was a fate worse than death, providing the ultimate, terrifying motive for an execution that was meticulously planned under the guise of an unpredictable act of nature. As detectives cross-referenced the newly uncovered financial motives with the historical weather data of that brutal November week, a chilling realization emerged. Arthur Vance did not react to the blizzard. He waited for it. The historic storm that paralyzed the Great Lakes region was predicted days in advance by meteorologists, giving Arthur the perfect window of absolute isolation to execute his plan. The modern reconstruction of the crime scene suggested that on the evening of November 14th, while the first heavy flakes of snow began to blanket Palmer Woods and cut off the neighborhood from emergency services, an intense confrontation broke out inside the mahogany-lined study. Clara, sitting at her desk with the incriminating financial documents spread before her, confronted her husband with the evidence that would destroy his life. The tension inside the mansion must have been suffocating, the wind howling against the leaded glass windows as Arthur realized his golden future was about to evaporate. In a sudden, calculated burst of rage, he lunged across the desk, his hands wrapping around Clara's neck, cutting off her breath before she could scream for help, silencing the only voice that could expose his fraudulent empire. The physical mechanics of the murder were only the beginning of Arthur's dark genius. It was the disposal of the body in the midst of a historic whiteout that had baffled investigators for over 3 decades. With 2 feet of snow rapidly accumulating outside and the roads completely impassable for standard vehicles, Arthur knew he could not simply drive a traditional car to a remote location without getting stuck or leaving an easily traceable path. Instead, the task force discovered through old equipment rental receipts that Arthur had purchased a heavy-duty, industrial-grade snowplow attachment for his 4-wheel drive pickup truck just 48 hours prior to the murder. Under the cover of the blinding storm, while the entire city of Detroit huddled indoors without electricity, Arthur loaded Clara's lifeless body into the back of his truck, covered it with heavy industrial tarps, and drove out into the white abyss. He didn't just drive. He plowed his own path through the deserted streets, blending in perfectly with the city's emergency maintenance vehicles, completely invisible to the few stranded motorists who caught a glimpse of his headlights through the roaring blizzard. His destination was the freezing, turbulent waters of the Detroit River, a treacherous stretch of currents that remained largely unfrozen due to the constant churn of industrial shipping traffic. The task force utilized modern oceanographic current modeling to determine exactly where Arthur had dropped the heavy, weighted industrial barrel containing Clara's remains. He had driven to an abandoned, unlit industrial pier in the Delray neighborhood, a desolate manufacturing sector completely deserted during the storm. There, in the freezing dark, with the wind roaring at 50 miles per hour, Arthur hauled the barrel to the edge of the pier and pushed it into the black, icy depths, watching it sink beneath the churning surface. He believed the river would carry his secret out into the vast, deep expanse of Lake Erie, erasing all evidence of his crime forever. He then drove back to Palmer Woods, carefully plowing over his own tracks to ensure that when the police finally arrived, the perimeter of his estate would appear completely undisturbed, a pristine blanket of white snow masking a horrific reality. When Detective Marcus Miller had arrived at the mansion on the morning of November 15, 1993, he was met with a theatrical performance that nearly succeeded in creating the perfect alibi. Arthur's calculated panic, the half-empty wine glass, the slightly open back door, the accumulation of snow on the kitchen tile, was designed to exploit the psychological biases of the investigators. Arthur wanted them to believe that Clara, suffering from a sudden mental health crisis or an overwhelming desire to escape, had walked out into the freezing night voluntarily, allowing the elements to destroy her. The Modern Behavioral Analysis Unit noted that Arthur aggressively steered the narrative toward a random abduction or a tragic suicide, using his wealth and social influence to flood the local media with pleas for her safe return. He weaponized his grief, appearing on local television stations weeping into his hands, a performance that bought him the crucial time needed to systematically destroy any lingering physical evidence inside the home before forensic science could catch up to him. But the one factor Arthur could not control was the terrifyingly precise evolution of forensic science and the digital trail left behind by his own arrogance. When he assumed the identity of Arthur Pendleton in California, he believed that a new name, a social security number purchased on the black market, and a series of cosmetic adjustments would be enough to sever his connection to Detroit forever. He built a new life on a foundation of lies, unaware that every time he smiled into a high-definition television camera for his hit reality show, he was broadcasting his biometric data to the entire world. In 2025, when the Detroit Cold Case Unit initiated the automated search using advanced AI-driven facial recognition software, the algorithm didn't just look at his silver hair or his altered nose. It mapped the immutable bone structure of his face, the distance between his eyes, and the unique geometry of his jawline. The digital system flagged Arthur Pendleton as a 99.8% match to the fugitive Arthur Vance, triggering a covert federal investigation that quietly monitored his glamorous life in Malibu while prosecutors built an airtight case. The covert operation, codenamed Operation Winter Freeze, saw federal agents embedding themselves within the television production company, posing as network executives and lighting technicians to closely observe Arthur's habits without raising suspicion. They intercepted his cellular communications, monitored his high-end financial transactions, and even recovered abandoned coffee cups from the studio set to secure a fresh DNA sample. When the laboratory confirmed that the DNA from the reality star perfectly matched the familial DNA profile generated from the remains found in the Detroit River, the trap was ready to spring. The choice to arrest him on live television was a deliberate psychological strategy. Investigators knew that a man with Arthur's narcissistic personality traits would be completely disarmed when his cherished public persona was violently stripped away in front of the audience he craved. The sudden appearance of tactical gear and real steel handcuffs on that pristine stage shattered his delusion of safety, forcing him to face the reality that 33 years of freedom had been nothing more than a temporary delay of execution. As the heavy iron doors of the Detroit detention facility slammed shut behind the elderly Arthur Vance, the city he had abandoned began the painful process of unearthing the full scope of his betrayal. The trial was not just a legal proceeding, it was a grand, national exposure of a sociopath who had used the cover of a historic natural disaster to murder his wife, and the power of modern television to hide in plain sight. Clara's family, who had spent decades living in the shadow of agonizing uncertainty, sat in the front row of the courtroom every day, holding portraits of the brilliant young woman whose life had been violently stolen for the sake of an unprincipled man's ambition. The defense attempted to argue that the passage of time had compromised the integrity of the evidence, but the combination of modern genetic genealogy, digital financial tracking, and the undeniable biometric matches created an inescapable cage of proof that no expensive attorney could dismantle. The final verdict of guilty brought an end to one of the most shocking chapters in the history of American true crime, a case that redefined the boundaries of how long-buried secrets can survive in the modern digital age. Arthur Vance was led away from the courtroom in chains, his eyes devoid of the charismatic spark that had captivated millions of television viewers, destined to spend the rest of his life as a nameless number in a maximum security prison. The hit show, Restoring the Ruins, was immediately canceled, its episodes scrubbed from streaming platforms, leaving behind a chilling void where a celebrated cultural icon used to stand. But for the people of Detroit, and for the memory of Clara Vance, the spectacular collapse of Arthur's empire was a profound victory for the silent dead, a definitive warning to those who believe they can outrun the past. The cold case that began in the freezing dark of a 1993 blizzard was finally closed, proved by the relentless march of science, and broadcast to the world as a timeless testament that justice does not decay, does not forget, and will always find a way to break through the screen. The conviction of Arthur Vance was supposed to close the book on the infamous 1993 Detroit cold case, but inside the walls of the Michigan State Penitentiary and within the secretive circles of federal forensic intelligence, a darker, even more unsettling reality was beginning to surface. When a man successfully evades the global dragnet of justice for over 3 decades, changing his identity, altering his face, and rising to the heights of national television fame, he does not do it completely alone. As investigators dug deeper into the financial ruins of Arthur's media empire and his past real estate dealings in California, they realized that the televised arrest was merely the tip of an iceberg that extended deep into a hidden network of corruption, black market identities, and institutional failures. The story of Clara Vance's murder was evolving from a tragic domestic homicide into a sprawling, multi-state conspiracy, forcing the Detroit Cold Case Task Force to reopen old field notes and track down a shadowy underworld of enablers who helped a monster hide in plain sight under the blinding glare of the Hollywood spotlight. The first major breakthrough of this secondary investigation came from an unexpected source: an encrypted digital drive discovered inside a false bottom safe in Arthur's luxury Malibu estate during a post-arrest federal search. The drive contained meticulous, decades-old records of financial transfers, encrypted emails, and scanned documents that dated back to the mid-1990s, revealing exactly how a fugitive from Detroit managed to acquire the clean, unblemished identity of Arthur Pendleton. The real Arthur Pendleton was a real estate appraiser from a small town in Oregon who had tragically died in a solo car accident in 1991, whose death had been recorded in local county archives, but never properly updated in the Federal Social Security Master Death Index. Arthur Vance, utilizing his wealth and connections within the construction and real estate industry, had paid an exorbitant sum to a high-level black market document broker operating out of Chicago to secure the deceased man's birth certificate and social security number. With these authentic papers, Vance was able to apply for a legitimate passport and driver's license, effectively executing an identity theft so seamless that standard background checks conducted by television networks decades later flagged absolutely nothing suspicious. As federal agents traced the lineage of the Chicago document broker, they uncovered a disturbing pattern of protection that had shielded Arthur Vance during his early, vulnerable years on the run. In 1994, while Detective Marcus Miller was frantically banging on the doors of corrupt city officials in Detroit trying to secure out-of-state search warrants, Arthur was already laundering his stolen assets through a complex web of offshore shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands. The task force's financial analysts discovered that Arthur didn't just flee with Clara's liquidated estate. He had systematically bled her corporate accounts dry through forged power of attorney documents executed days before the murder. This stolen wealth became his shield, allowing him to bribe crooked accountants and legal consultants who asked no questions about the origins of the millions of dollars pouring into his new California real estate ventures. The sheer scale of the financial insulation explained why old leads had dried up so quickly in 1993. Every time the police got close to a financial trail, a barrier of high-priced corporate lawyers and shell corporations blocked their path, leaving the original detectives chasing ghosts while the killer was busy building a media empire. Meanwhile, back in Detroit, the psychological trauma inflicted upon the community of Palmer Woods began to re-emerge as old witnesses, now elderly, finally found the courage to speak without fear of retribution from the powerful Vance family line. A former housekeeper who had worked for a neighboring estate in 1993 came forward with a piece of information that chilled investigators to the bone. She revealed that on the night of November 14th, during the height of the blinding blizzard, she had looked out the window and seen a dark, heavy-duty pickup truck idling at the end of the Vance driveway, its headlights turned off, its exhaust pipe sending thick, ghostly plumes of white smoke into the freezing air. She had seen a tall silhouette, matching Arthur's physical build, struggling to carry a large, heavy object wrapped in industrial plastic out of the basement walkout door and into the bed of the truck. The witness had stayed silent for 33 years because Arthur had cornered her at a local grocery store days after the disappearance, looking at her with cold, dead eyes and whispering a casual, terrifying threat about what happened to people who gossiped to the police. This lingering culture of fear had paralyzed the initial investigation, proving that Arthur's true weapon was not just the blizzard, but his terrifying ability to psychologically dominate everyone in his orbit. The modern task force realized that to truly honor the memory of Clara Vance, they had to dismantle the entire apparatus that allowed her killer to thrive as a celebrated reality television icon. Prosecutors began systematically arresting his former business partners, the corrupt document brokers, and the legal fixers who had turned a blind eye to his lack of a credible past, sending a clear message across the entertainment industry that corporate complicity with the fugitive would carry a devastating price. The media circus surrounding the case intensified as investigative journalists began producing primetime documentaries analyzing every episode of Restoring the Ruins, pointing out the sickening irony of a man who specialized in unearthing hidden spaces and structural rot while keeping his own horrific secret buried in his soul. In every frame of film, viewers could now see the subtle, predatory calculations of a psychopath, transforming his beloved television persona into a national symbol of deception and modern horror. Inside his maximum security prison cell, stripped of the adulation, the tailored suits, and the high-definition cameras, Arthur Vance remained defiant, refusing to reveal the location of the remaining evidence or the names of the individuals who helped him manipulate the system for over 3 decades. But his silence no longer mattered. The digital and forensic dragnet had done its job, proving that in the 21st century, the past is never truly dead, it is merely waiting to be decoded. The Palmer Woods Mansion, which had undergone multiple ownership changes over the decades, was officially designated a historic site of forensic significance, its dark corridors forever scrubbed of Arthur's influence, but eternally echoing with the story of the brilliant woman who refused to let her killer win. As the final legal appeals were exhausted and the secondary conspirators were led away in handcuffs, the definitive truth of the Detroit 1993 cold case stood as a monumental triumph for modern investigative science. It proved that no matter how glamorous the lie, no matter how many millions of viewers tune in to watch a manufactured illusion, the cold, unyielding weight of justice will always break through the screen, dragging the monsters out of the studio lights and back into the freezing dark where they belong. The shockwaves from the televised arrest of Arthur Vance did not stop at the boundaries of media sensationalism or the immediate satisfaction of a closed police file. By the summer of 2026, as federal prosecutors and the Detroit Cold Case Task Force prepared the final, monumental omnibus indictment against Vance's broader network of enablers, a terrifying new chapter of the investigation began to unfold. It became painfully clear that a narcissist of Arthur's caliber, a man who possessed the chilling capability to dismember his wife during a historic blizzard and seamlessly transition into a Hollywood elite, did not simply turn his predatory instincts off once he crossed the state line into California. Homicide detectives in Los Angeles, working in absolute secrecy alongside the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, began to ask a question that sent a collective shiver through the entire law enforcement community. What did Arthur Pendleton do during the decades he spent building his real estate and television empire in the West Coast? If the brilliant Clara Vance could be erased from existence for threatening his financial security, who else had crossed paths with the silver-haired mogul and paid the ultimate price for discovering the rot beneath his pristine facade? The terrifying pivot into a potential multi-jurisdictional serial homicide investigation began when analysts from the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, cooperating with the Cold Case Task Force, began running Arthur's verified California timelines against the national databases of unsolved disappearances, mysterious hidden runs, and unexplained industrial accidents. Between the years of 1996 and 2015, long before he secured his own primetime reality television slot on Restoring the Ruins, Arthur Pendleton operated as a high-stakes, ruthless real estate speculator, purchasing abandoned commercial properties, historic theaters, and decaying industrial warehouses across Southern California. He was a man who frequently traveled alone, driving massive, company-owned utility trucks through the desolate stretches of the Mojave Desert and the isolated mountain passes of San Bernardino to inspect potential land acquisitions. Wherever his construction crews went, they brought noise, heavy machinery, deep excavations, and an absolute control over private land that was entirely blocked off from public scrutiny by high chain-link fences and security guards. The first chilling anomaly that caught the attention of federal investigators was the case of Elena Rostova, a 24-year-old immigrant from Eastern Europe who had been hired as a hospitality coordinator for one of Arthur's elite corporate launch parties in Malibu back in 2004. Elena was an incredibly bright, ambitious young woman who, according to her surviving diaries and emails to her family back home, had been tasked with organizing Arthur's private financial ledgers for his real estate investments in the Pacific Northwest. Just 3 weeks into her employment, Elena abruptly vanished, leaving behind her rented apartment in Santa Monica with all her personal belongings untouched, her car parked in the driveway, and her bank accounts frozen in time. At the time of her disappearance, local police treated it as a runaway case, blinded by Arthur's polished corporate statements and his high-powered legal team, who claimed she had simply stolen a small cash advance and broken her contract to return to her home country. But when modern digital forensics swept Arthur's seized Malibu server in 2026, they discovered an encrypted file containing scans of Elena's actual passport, her original social security card, and a series of terrifying, unedited security footage clips from his private office showing her in a state of visible distress, confronting him just hours before she was never seen again. The methodology behind Arthur Vance's survival was rooted in his absolute mastery of physical space and structural architecture. As a master contractor and historical restoration expert, he knew exactly how the world was built, and more importantly, he knew how to hide things within the very bones of the structures he renovated. The federal task force, realizing the catastrophic implications of his professional access, initiated a massive, unprecedented forensic operation utilizing ground-penetrating radar, canine search teams, and thermal imaging across 7 major historical properties renovated by Arthur's companies over a 20-year period. The logistical scale of the search was staggering, drawing local police departments, structural engineers, and forensic anthropologists into a coordinated effort to tear down false walls, rip up reinforced concrete foundations, and excavate abandoned elevator shafts that had been sealed under Arthur's personal supervision. The nightmare became a reality during the excavation of an old, historic bank building in downtown Los Angeles that Arthur's company had converted into luxury lofts in 2008. Deep within the subbasement, beneath a thick, 3-foot layer of industrial-grade poured concrete that had been laid down unexpectedly during a holiday weekend when the regular construction crew was dismissed, the ground-penetrating radar flagged a significant, unnatural anomaly. Specialized forensic teams worked for 48 hours straight, cutting through the dense matrix of rebar and concrete, breathing in the white dust of a buried secret until their tools finally struck a hollow space. Inside a heavily reinforced, airtight structural void deliberately built into the foundation wall, investigators discovered the skeletal remains of Elena Rostova, her identity confirmed within hours by rapid DNA sequencing. The horror that had begun in the snows of Detroit had traveled across the continent, proving that Arthur Vance was not a one-time killer driven to madness by a domestic dispute. He was a cold, calculating, systematic predator who used his profession as a literal graveyard for anyone who dared to glimpse the darkness behind his mask. The revelation of a second victim transformed the entire legal landscape, elevating the case from a local Michigan homicide to a sprawling, high-profile federal prosecution that dominated the national consciousness. The media circus surrounding the Michigan State Prison where Arthur was being held grew into a permanent encampment of satellite trucks, journalists, and true crime documentarians, all demanding answers from a man who had successfully weaponized the American dream to hide his monstrous reality. The public was gripped by a deep, collective paranoia, as millions of people who had watched Restoring the Ruins realized that the charismatic man they had invited into their living rooms every week, the man they had cheered for as he rebuilt communities, was actively hiding the decaying remains of his victims within the very walls he claimed to restore. Every episode of his show was reanalyzed with a sickening new perspective, the casual jokes he made about burying the old problems or starting with a clean foundation, taking on a sinister, literal meaning that horrified his former audience. As the behavioral analyst sat across from Arthur Vance in the sterile, high-security interrogation room of the federal penitentiary, the old killer's composure finally began to crack under the weight of the undeniable physical evidence. Stripped of his tailored designer shirts, his professional lighting, and the protective barrier of his millions, he looked smaller, older, his silver hair unkempt, his eyes darting frantically around the room as the lead FBI interrogator placed the forensic photographs of Elena's recovery site onto the metal table. For hours, Arthur maintained a stony, arrogant silence, attempting to play the role of the misunderstood visionary who is being persecuted by a sensationalist system, but his breathing grew shallow and his hands shook uncontrollably as the details of his architectural blueprints were laid out side by side with the forensic reports. The task force didn't just have the body. They had the digital receipts proving Arthur had personally ordered the specific, rapid-hardening concrete mix used to seal the vault on the exact date Elena vanished, destroying his final illusion of plausible deniability. The tragedy of the Detroit 1993 cold case had officially evolved into a dark monument of modern criminal history, a definitive case study in how wealth, charm, and the superficial nature of celebrity culture can blind society to the presence of absolute evil. The investigation into Arthur Vance's long, undetected reign of terror was far from over, with detectives continuing to cross-reference his real estate portfolio against dozens of other unsolved missing persons cases along the West Coast, realizing that the true body count of his decades on the run might never be fully known. Yet, as the sun set over the Detroit River and the lights flickered on across the changing landscape of Palmer Woods, there was a profound, unyielding sense of justice prevailing over time. Clara Vance and Elena Rostova, two brilliant young women separated by decades and thousands of miles, had finally broken through the silence of their graves, their memory vindicated by the relentless march of forensic science, leaving their killer completely exposed under the harsh, unyielding light of truth that no television screen could ever dim. The discovery of Elena Rostova's remains beneath 3 feet of industrial concrete in a downtown Los Angeles subbasement shattered any remaining illusions that Arthur Vance's criminal history began and ended in the frozen suburbs of Detroit. By the late autumn of 2026, the joint FBI and Detroit Cold Case Task Force found themselves standing on the precipice of a terrifyingly vast psychological labyrinth. The question was no longer whether Arthur Vance was a serial predator, but rather how deep into the infrastructure of the American landscape his hidden graveyards actually ran. To map the true scope of his decades on the run, behavioral profilers and structural forensic experts had to completely dismantle his 30-year career as a master builder. They had to look past the charming television host who revitalized broken neighborhoods on restoring the ruins and focus entirely on the cold, calculating architect who possessed a lethal expertise in void spaces, structural concrete, and the terrifying art of making human beings permanently vanish into the built environment. As the task force's digital analytics team began a massive, comprehensive data mining operation, they constructed a timeline that tracked every single commercial property, residential estate, and industrial park Arthur Vance had personally inspected, purchased, or renovated since he assumed the identity of Arthur Pendleton in 1995. The results were deeply unsettling. Vance had not simply stayed in California. His real estate speculation firm had quietly expanded its reach into the rapidly growing tech hubs of the Pacific Northwest, the desolate desert expansions of Nevada, and the revitalized riverfront districts of Ohio. Wherever his name appeared on building permits, a pattern emerged. He almost always insisted on personally supervising the early-phase foundation pours, the sealing of old subterranean maintenance shafts, and the demolition of historic masonry walls. He was a billionaire who still loved to get his hands dirty, a quirk his television fans found endearing, but one that investigators now recognized as a mandatory tactical routine designed to ensure his macabre secrets remained entombed beneath tons of aggregate stone and reinforced steel. The investigation took a dramatic and chilling turn when detectives uncovered a series of private, handwritten journals hidden within a secure storage facility in Seattle, Washington, a property registered under a shell corporation that Arthur Vance believed was completely untraceable. These journals did not contain explicit confessions of murder, but rather a deeply disturbing, coded system of architectural measurements, geographic coordinates, and dates that corresponded precisely with the sudden disappearances of young women across the country over a 25-year period. Behavioral analysts from the FBI spent weeks decoding the meticulous entries, realizing that Vance viewed his victims not just as threats to his security or objects of his rage, but as permanent structural anchors of his real estate empire. He had developed a sickening, narcissistic ritual. Every time he successfully eliminated someone who crossed him or discovered his true identity, he would commemorate the act by burying a personal item of theirs or their actual remains within the foundational concrete of a multi-million-dollar landmark project, effectively transforming his architectural legacy into a hidden monument of death. With this chilling blueprint in hand, the federal government initiated Operation Foundation Stone, the largest forensic excavation of commercial real estate in United States history. Specialized teams equipped with high-resolution ground-penetrating radar, concrete coring drills, and highly trained forensic canine units descended upon an upscale waterfront development in Portland, Oregon, which Vance's company had constructed in 2012. The atmosphere at the site was suffocatingly tense. Construction workers and local residents watched in absolute silence as federal agents cordoned off the main promenade, erecting massive black privacy tents over the pristine concrete walkways. For 72 hours, the rhythmic, deafening roar of industrial diamond saws cut through the air, mirroring the tension gripping the nation as the live news feeds from outside the perimeter reported every twist and turn of the search. Deep within the structural support pillars of the main parking garage, the radar flagged a series of anomalous, density-shifting voids that perfectly matched the coded coordinates found in Vance's Seattle journals. When the heavy concrete cores were finally extracted and brought to a mobile forensic laboratory on site, the horrors contained within them confirmed the task force's worst fears. Investigators discovered the preserved personal effects, identification cards, and skeletal remains of two more missing women: Sarah Jenkins, a 21-year-old architectural intern who vanished from a Seattle job site in 2010, and Maya Lin, a 26-year-old real estate accountant who had abruptly resigned from Vance's firm in 2014 before completely evaporating from all digital records. Forensic pathologists determined that both women had been subjected to the same ruthless, highly precise method of strangulation that had taken the life of Clara Vance in Detroit 33 years earlier. The realization that Arthur Vance had been operating an active, nationwide pipeline of homicide while simultaneously being celebrated as a cultural icon and humanitarian mentor sent a wave of profound revulsion and existential shock through the entertainment industry and the public alike. The legal and financial fallout from these discoveries was catastrophic, completely paralyzing the corporate entities that had funded and broadcasted, restoring the ruins. The television network faced a multi-billion-dollar wave of class action lawsuits from victims' families, sponsors, and production crew members who realized they had been working alongside and actively enriching one of the most prolific and deceptive killers in modern history. Every frame of footage featuring Arthur Vance was pulled from global broadcast syndication. His name was chiseled off the fronts of buildings he had funded, and his vast financial empire was frozen by federal asset forfeiture orders, ensuring that every cent of his stolen wealth would be redirected toward the massive forensic costs and restitution for the families of his victims. The man who had sacrificed everything to protect his image and his fortune was now watching his entire existence be systematically dismantled, his legacy erased from the culture, leaving behind nothing but the cold, unyielding reality of his crimes. Inside the high-security interrogation room at the federal penitentiary, the psychological dynamic between Arthur Vance and the lead investigators underwent a dramatic shift. The arrogant, smooth-talking celebrity who had initially tried to dismiss the evidence had completely vanished, replaced by a hollow, desperate old man who finally understood that his absolute control over his environment had been permanently shattered. As the lead FBI profiler methodically laid out the forensic profiles of Clara, Elena, Sarah, and Maya across the table, Arthur looked at the images not with remorse, but with a terrifying, detached curiosity. He realized that the technology of the 21st century, the genetic genealogy that identified Clara, the facial recognition that caught his television broadcasts, and the ground-penetrating radar that tore through his concrete vaults had rendered his brilliant architectural hiding places completely obsolete. The very modern world he had exploited to achieve fame had ultimately become the inescapable cage that trapped him. The narrative of the Detroit 1993 cold case had officially transformed from a single, haunting, unsolved mystery into an epic, multi-state triumph of modern forensic science over decades of calculated deception. The pursuit of justice for Clara Vance had opened a door into a dark underworld of survival, exposing how a single act of domestic violence can warp an individual into a lifetime predator if left unchecked by the system. As winter began to settle over Detroit once again, casting a gray, familiar chill across the streets of Palmer Woods, the community finally found a sense of profound, historical closure. The snows of 1993 could no longer hide the truth, and the dark water of the river had given up its dead, proving to a watching world that time is no barrier to justice, and that no matter how deep a killer buries his secrets, the light of truth will eventually cut through the concrete, dragging the monsters out of the dark and into the unforgiving light of day. The excavation of the Portland waterfront development and the subsequent recovery of Sarah Jenkins and Maya Lin pushed the United States Department of Justice into uncharted legal territory. By December 2026, Arthur Vance was no longer viewed merely as a fugitive from a localized 1993 Detroit homicide. He was legally reclassified as an elite, high-profile federal operative of death, a corporate serial predator who had seamlessly integrated his lethal pathology into the multi-million-dollar machine of American reality television. As the national media descended upon the federal court complex, a new and deeply unsettling phase of the investigation began. The focus shifted away from the physical concrete foundations of his real estate portfolio and slammed directly into the highly complex, dark psychology of his 30-year evasion. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, cooperating with elite cyberforensics teams, set out to answer the ultimate, lingering paradox of the case. How did a man whose face was broadcast into 40 million households every single week manage to suppress the paralyzing fear of being recognized, and what internal mechanism allowed him to look directly into a high-definition camera lens without blinking? The answer lay buried deep within the digital architecture of Vance's private life, specifically within a highly secure, offline local area network discovered inside the soundproofed media room of his Malibu compound. When federal cyber analysts finally bypassed the multi-layered encryption protocols that protected his private archives, they did not find typical financial spreadsheets or routine corporate documentation. Instead, they unearthed a massive, highly organized digital library of surveillance data, network feeds, and raw, unedited footage from the production archives of Restoring the Ruins. Arthur Vance had been using his absolute corporate authority as an executive producer of the show to systematically monitor the very people who were filming him. He had placed hidden, pinhole cameras inside the production trailers, the editing bays, and the executive suites of the television network. Every email, every phone log, and every casual conversation between network executives regarding background checks, fan mail, or unexpected inquiries from law enforcement had been intercepted, logged, and analyzed by Vance for over a decade. This meant that his legendary, unshakable confidence on television was not born out of blind luck. It was the result of a meticulously constructed, near-perfect counterintelligence operation. Vance knew exactly what the network's legal and security teams knew about him at any given second. If a viewer sent an email to the network pointing out that the handsome contractor bore a striking resemblance to an old missing person flyer from Michigan, Vance saw it first. The digital forensic audit revealed that between 2016 and 2024, at least 14 separate individuals, ranging from true crime enthusiasts to older Detroit expatriates living in California, had flagged his face to the network's public feedback portal. In every single instance, Vance had used his corporate security team, which was staffed entirely by corrupt, highly paid former private investigators, to intercept those messages, delete them from the master servers, and quietly intimidate or discredit the senders before their suspicions could ever reach the desk of a real police detective. The psychological profile that emerged from these findings was that of an apex narcissistic sociopath who derived an intense, almost addictive thrill from his public exposure. The behavioral analysts realized that Arthur Vance didn't just hide behind his reality TV persona, he weaponized it. He viewed his fame as the ultimate, impenetrable shield. In his warped, hyper-calculating mind, he believed that the American public was fundamentally incapable of associating a beloved, philanthropic television star with the horrific, frozen image of a 1993 domestic strangler. He used his on-screen charm to gaslight an entire nation, transforming his real-world arrogance into an endearing television personality that made him completely untouchable. The sheer audacity of his lifestyle was his greatest defense. By standing in the brightest light possible, he made it completely impossible for anyone to see the deep, terrifying shadows that followed him everywhere he went. But as the winter of 2026 deepened, the walls of his digital fortress continued to crumble, exposing a final, devastating betrayal that struck at the very heart of his remaining family line. In Detroit, specialized financial investigators tracking the original 1993 asset liquidation discovered a secret, recurring offshore trust fund that had been quietly paying out massive, six-figure sums to a highly respected, retired administrative official within the Michigan judicial system. This official, who had served as a chief clerk during the height of Detective Marcus Miller's original investigation, had been systematically bribed by Arthur Vance's family to ensure that any out-of-state leads, wiretap requests, or interstate extradition warrants regarding the Clara Vance file were quietly misrouted, delayed, or permanently buried under mountains of bureaucratic red tape. This institutional corruption explained the profound, agonizing attack that had paralyzed the original detectives. They hadn't failed due to a lack of effort. They had been systematically sabotaged from within their own courthouse by a hidden hand funded by the very man they were trying to catch. The exposure of this legal treachery ignited a massive political scandal in Michigan, leading to the immediate stripping of pensions, public indictments, and the systemic restructuring of historical cold case archives across the state. The public's fury reached a boiling point as they realized that Clara Vance's family had been denied justice for 33 years not because her killer was a ghost, but because the machinery of the law had been bought and paid for by the Vance fortune. The narrative was no longer a simple story of an unsolved crime. It was a profound, national reckoning with the deep-seated flaws of a system where wealth could buy absolute invisibility, even when that invisibility was broadcast in prime-time, high definition. Back inside the maximum security federal facility, Arthur Vance's physical deterioration was accelerating. The calculated, silver fox image he had projected to millions was completely gone, replaced by a gray, hollow shell of a man whose true age was finally catching up to him in the absence of cosmetic enhancements and professional wardrobe teams. During a high-stakes, closed-door deposition on December 18th, federal prosecutors presented him with the complete digital evidence of his network surveillance and the indictments of his corrupt legal fixers. For the first time since his dramatic televised arrest, Arthur Vance looked truly broken. He realized that the vast, intricate network of human corruption and digital manipulation he had spent his entire adult life building had been utterly neutralized by the cold, emotionless efficiency of modern data analytics. The legacy of the Detroit 1993 cold case had officially redefined the entire landscape of modern true crime and investigative journalism. It served as a terrifying, definitive proof that the most dangerous monsters do not always hide in the dark, abandoned alleys of the inner city. Sometimes, they stand under the brightest lights imaginable, smiling directly at us through a screen, wrapped in the fabric of our trust and admiration. As the final legal motions were filed and the multi-state trials loomed on the horizon of 1997, the memory of Clara Vance stood as a powerful, unyielding beacon of endurance. Her voice, silenced so violently in the dark of a forgotten blizzard, had broken through decades of corporate greed, media manipulation, and legal corruption, proving that the truth cannot be buried, cannot be paved over, and will always find a way to tear down the screen to claim its final, absolute victory. By the dawn of 2027, the psychological warfare between federal prosecutors and Arthur Vance entered a dark, deeply claustrophobic phase within the walls of the Administrative Segregation Unit. The corporate infrastructure that had sustained the myth of Arthur Pendleton was completely dead, its assets liquidated, its shell companies dissolved, and its media archives permanently locked under federal asset forfeiture laws. Yet, the ghost of the 1993 Detroit winter still refused to fully settle into the earth. The modern task force, despite having secured multiple life sentences across different state jurisdictions, faced a final, maddening hurdle: the complete mapping of Arthur's unrecorded transit routes during the dark years of 1994 and 1995. This was the critical, missing transition period, the brief, shadowy window between the moment he vanished from the Palmer Woods mansion in Michigan and the moment he emerged in Southern California with a pristine, high-level black market identity. Investigators knew that a killer does not simply stop breathing or acting during a high-stakes flight across the continent. They knew that the interstate highway system hid its own secrets, and that Arthur's trail of blood had left a permanent, invisible scar across the heartland of America. To decode this missing timeline, a specialized team of geographic behavioral profilers from the FBI's Quantico headquarters began working alongside retrotechnologists to reconstruct Arthur's movement patterns through obsolete financial records and analog travel footprints. In 1994, long before the ubiquity of smartphones, GPS tracking, and automated license plate readers, a fugitive relied entirely on cash, paper maps, payphones, and the absolute anonymity of roadside motels that dotted the American interstate system. The task force began a massive, historical audit of regional banking records from the Midwest to the West Coast, tracking the sudden, systematic withdrawals of cash from obscure, small-town bank branches that aligned with the liquidation path of Clara Vance's personal wealth. What they discovered was a chilling, erratic trajectory that proved Arthur did not take a direct route to California. Instead, he hovered like a phantom predator through the industrial corridors of Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, changing vehicles, altering his appearance, and leaving behind a series of chilling, unresolved anomalies. The focus of the interstate investigation quickly slammed into the small town of Gary, Indiana, a once thriving industrial hub that by 1994 had devolved into a landscape of abandoned steel mills, crumbling brick structures, and economic desolation. According to newly recovered microfiched lodging receipts, a man matching Arthur's physical description and utilizing a temporary, forged Michigan driver's license had checked into a secluded, rundown motel off Interstate 80 under the name Robert Vance. He remained stayed at this location for nearly 3 months, completely isolated from his former high society circles, living off the cash he had stolen from his dead wife's accounts. Local police archives from that exact summer revealed a terrifying spike in unsolved disappearances involving young, vulnerable women who frequented the transit stops and 24-hour diners along the highway corridor, a demographic that Arthur, in his desperate, high-stress state of flight, could easily target without drawing the attention of federal authorities who were still searching for him in wealthy suburbs. The most prominent and haunting case tied to this specific timeline was that of Linda Cooper, a 19-year-old night shift waitress who worked at a popular truck stop just a quarter mile from the motel where Arthur was hiding. On the night of August 12, 1994, Linda finished her shift, walked out into the humid, heavy night air toward her car, and vanished from the face of the earth, leaving her keys on the asphalt and the driver's side door wide open. For 33 years, her family had lived with the agonizing weight of a cold case, believing she had fallen victim to a random, passing long-haul trucker. But when the modern cold case task force utilized advanced digital enhancement software to analyze a graining, low-resolution security videotape from a neighboring gas station that had been preserved in the local police evidence locker, they flagged a chilling detail: an old, dark-colored pickup truck with Michigan license plates, matching the exact make and model of the vehicle Arthur had used to transport Clara's body through the Detroit blizzard, was seen idling in the shadows of the truck stop parking lot just minutes before Linda disappeared. The tactical methodology of the modern investigation had to adapt to the absolute lack of direct DNA evidence from this specific period, forcing prosecutors to build an airtight case based on behavioral typography and spatial temporal profiling. The FBI's analysts noted that Arthur's violence was invariably triggered by threats to his control or intense periods of psychological isolation. In the summer of 1994, Cut off from the luxury, power, and adulation he considered his birthright, Arthur was a highly volatile, deeply frustrated sociopath who viewed every human interaction through the lens of survival and dominance. The recovery of Linda Cooper's case allowed prosecutors to establish a clear, uninterrupted pattern of behavior that linked his actions in Detroit directly to his subsequent crimes in California, destroying his defense team's argument that the murder of Clara Vance was an isolated, situational incident of domestic passion. Back inside the federal detention complex, the psychological landscape shifted as the task force prepared to present the Indiana evidence to Arthur Vance. The lead interrogator, an expert in narcissistic personality disorders, understood that the only way to break Arthur's wall of silence was to strike directly at his vanity, to remind him that despite his decades of brilliant corporate maneuvering and international television fame, his legacy was ultimately being defined by the cheap, forgotten ruins of a roadside motel in Gary, Indiana. When the forensic photographs of the old truck stop and the missing person posters of Linda Cooper were placed onto the stainless steel table, Arthur's reaction was not one of fear, but of absolute, chilling contempt. He looked at the images of the young waitress with a cold, superior smirk, refusing to speak a single word on the record, but his physical tells, the sudden clenching of his jaw, the rapid tapping of his fingers against the metal, betrayed the terrifying truth that he remembered every single second of that dark, forgotten summer. The expanding scope of the case forced the entertainment industry into a deeper, more permanent state of cultural self-reflection and legal paralysis. The realization that Arthur Vance had used the profits from his early interstate crimes to fund the initial real estate investments that eventually led to his television stardom meant that every single dollar generated by restoring the ruins was legally classified as the direct proceeds of serial homicide. The network's legal departments were forced to completely restructure their production protocols, implementing unprecedented, multi-layered background checks that included forensic behavioral profiling and deep-dive genetic screening for all future on-screen talent. The man who had sought to become the ultimate symbol of modern American restoration had instead become the catalyst for the complete destruction of trust within the medium he loved, his name forever synonymous with the absolute limit of human deception. As the winter of 2027 rolled across the Great Lakes, bringing a bitter, familiar frost to the streets of Detroit and the quiet expanses of Palmer Woods, the multi-state legal machine moved inexorably toward its final, historic conclusion. The memory of Clara Vance, which had served as the original, unyielding anchor of this decades-long pursuit, was now joined by the voices of Elena, Sarah, Maya, and Linda, a chorus of forgotten lives that had finally broken through the silence of their hidden graves. The narrative was no longer just about an old cold case solved by a sudden television arrest. It had become a profound, historical monument to the endurance of investigative science and the absolute refusal of the law to let the passage of time erase the blood from a killer's hands. The screen had been torn down, the lights had been turned off, and Arthur Vance was left alone in the dark of his cell, forever haunted by the realization that no matter how far he ran down the interstate of his ambition, the past was always driving faster, waiting in the shadows to drag him back to the freezing ground where his sins began. By the spring of 2027, the Department of Justice's Specialized Financial Crimes Division, working alongside the Interstate Cold Case Alliance, had successfully traced the trail of blood and stolen currency from the decaying highways of Indiana directly into the sun-drenched, high-stakes real estate market of Las Vegas, Nevada. The year was 1995, the precise historical inflection point where the fugitive Arthur Vance completely shed the last ragged remnants of his Midwestern identity and fully transformed into the untouchable corporate phantom known as Arthur Pendleton. To the modern task force, this period represented the birth of the monster's modern incarnation. They knew that the millions of dollars stolen from Clara Vance's corporate accounts in Detroit had to be washed through a high-volume, highly unregulated financial system before they could be used to launch a legitimate California development firm. In 1995, there was no place on Earth better suited for dissolving large sums of untraceable cash into thin air than the glittering, neon-lit casino floor operations of the Las Vegas Strip, a desert oasis built entirely on the principle of absolute discretion and structural reinvention. The task force's investigative strategy shifted toward a microscopic forensic audit of historic gaming ledger archives, currency transaction reports, and property deeds from Clark County, Nevada, dating back 32 years. What they uncovered was a masterclass in financial camouflage. Arthur Vance had not arrived in Las Vegas as a desperate runner. He had arrived as a highly polished, wealthy international speculator utilizing a sequence of highly sophisticated offshore corporate entities registered in Panama and Vanuatu. Operating out of a luxury penthouse suite at a prominent, newly constructed resort, he systematically converted his stolen cash into high-denomination casino chips, played low-risk games for hours to create a legitimate gambling trail, and then cashed out receiving clean, official casino checks that could be deposited into any traditional American bank without triggering federal money laundering alarms. This brilliant, calculating routine allowed him to successfully inject over $4 million of blood money into the clean financial mainstream, providing the ultimate, unblemished seed capital required to purchase his first major commercial properties in Los Angeles and Malibu. But as the modern forensic team dug deeper into the local real estate records of that specific 1995 desert interlude, they discovered that Arthur's psychological need for violence had once again left a permanent, invisible scar on the local community. During his 4-month stay in Las Vegas, Arthur Vance had aggressively pursued the acquisition of a historic, abandoned mid-century motel located on the forgotten fringes of the old downtown district, intending to demolish it and build a modern commercial plaza. The listing agent for that property was a sharp, 31-year-old independent real estate broker named Diana Mercer. Diana was an incredibly meticulous professional who, according to her archived corporate correspondence, had begun to express serious, growing concerns regarding the authenticity of Arthur Pendleton's financial backers. She had initiated a private background check through a local private investigator, attempting to verify the origins of the Panamanian shell companies before signing off on the final escrow agreements. Just 48 hours before the real estate transaction was scheduled to close, Diana Mercer completely vanished from the city. Her abandoned vehicle was discovered parked outside her real estate office on a blistering July morning, the keys still in the ignition, her purse sitting on the front passenger seat, and her corporate files regarding the downtown motel transaction entirely missing from her desk. At the time, the local police department, overwhelmed by the city's rapid expansion and a crushing wave of transient crime, treated her disappearance as a routine missing persons case, assuming she had simply broken under the intense pressure of personal debt and fled the state. However, when the modern cold case task force utilized advanced digital imaging to analyze Arthur Vance's private, encrypted Malibu server in 2026, they discovered a hidden folder containing digitized copies of Diana Mercer's private background check files, her personal credit reports, and a series of detailed, high-resolution photographs of her office interior taken from a vehicle parked across the street days before she disappeared. The revelation of a potential fifth victim in the Nevada desert forced federal prosecutors to expand the scope of Operation Foundation Stone into a full-scale, multi-state archaeological excavation of Arthur Vance's earliest commercial developments. In March 2027, a heavily armed federal task force, accompanied by forensic geophysicists, canine search units, and heavy industrial excavation equipment, descended upon the commercial plaza in downtown Las Vegas that Arthur's firm had constructed on the site of the old motel back in late 1995. The logistics of the operation were incredibly intense. Federal authorities completely shut down a 3-block commercial sector, erecting massive, soundproof perimeter barriers to block the view of local media drones and the thousands of onlookers who gathered daily behind the police lines. For 5 days, industrial diamond-tipped drills bored deep into the subterranean concrete columns that supported the plaza's multi-story parking deck, searching for the specific structural anomalies that perfectly matched Arthur's signature architectural void patterns. On the 6th night of the excavation, deep within the primary load-bearing foundation wall located 12 feet beneath the desert surface, the ground-penetrating radar flagged an unnatural, density-shifting shadow sealed inside a reinforced concrete vault. Forensic anthropologists worked with extreme precision, utilizing specialized hand tools to chip away the dense aggregate stone until they finally breached a hollow structural cavity. Inside that dark, airtight space, investigators recovered the skeletal remains of Diana Mercer, her identity confirmed within hours by rapid genetic sequencing matching her surviving family members. She had been subjected to the exact same lethal, precise method of manual strangulation that had taken the lives of Clara Vance in Detroit and Elena Rostova in Los Angeles, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that Arthur Vance was a highly methodical, systematic executioner who treated human life as a simple, disposable obstacle to his corporate ambitions. The discovery of Diana Mercer's remains in Las Vegas sent an absolute shockwave through the national legal system, completely destroying his defense team's final remaining narrative strategy. Arthur's high-priced corporate defense attorneys had consistently attempted to portray the killer as an elderly, fragile man who was the victim of circumstantial, technologically overinterpreted evidence from decades ago. But the undeniable physical proof of a 5-victim interstate pipeline of homicide, spanning from the freezing blizzards of Michigan to the desolate highways of Indiana and the scorched concrete foundations of Nevada, exposed him to the world as one of the most prolific, calculating corporate serial predators in the history of the United States. The public's revulsion transformed into an absolute demand for ultimate accountability, with multiple state governors initiating unprecedented legal coordination to ensure that Arthur Vance would face consecutive trials in every single jurisdiction where he had hidden his victims. Back inside the maximum security federal administrative facility, the psychological decomposition of Arthur Vance was nearly complete. Stripped of his tailored designer wardrobe, the flattering high-definition studio lighting, and the protective, multi-million-dollar barrier of his media empire, he sat in his sterile, concrete cell as a hollow, defeated monument to his own hubris. During a high-stakes interrogation on April 4th, federal prosecutors placed the forensic photographs of the Las Vegas excavation site and the recovered personal effects of Diana Mercer directly onto the stainless steel table before him. For the first time in the entire history of the case, Arthur did not smirk, did not make an arrogant remark, and did not look at the ceiling with detached contempt. Instead, he stared blankly at the images of the desert concrete, his hands shaking violently inside his orange jumpsuit, finally realizing that the very modern world he had manipulated to achieve fame had transformed into an inescapable, digital trap that had systematically dismantled every single lie he had ever told. The legacy of the Detroit 1993 cold case had officially transcended the boundaries of traditional true crime history, evolving into a profound, national testament to the absolute endurance of investigative science and the unyielding weight of justice. The pursuit that had begun in the freezing dark of a forgotten Michigan winter had successfully illuminated a dark, coast-to-coast highway of deception, tracking down a monster who had spent 30 years hiding under the absolute brightest lights imaginable. As the sun began to set over the Detroit River, casting a long, familiar shadow across the historic brick facades of Palmer Woods, the voices of Clara, Elena, Sarah, Maya, and Diana finally echoed together with absolute, historical clarity. They were no longer lost names in a forgotten filing cabinet. They were the ultimate victors over a sociopath's ambition, their memory permanently vindicated by the light of truth that no television screen could ever dim, and no amount of poured concrete could ever bury. The recovery of Diana Mercer's remains from the scorched foundations of the Las Vegas Plaza marked the point of no return for the federal prosecution, effectively transforming the legal strategy into a weapon of absolute attrition. By the summer of 2026, the Department of Justice had weaponized the newly established RICO statutes for serial homicide, targeting not just Arthur Vance, but the entire corporate apparatus he had established to facilitate his multi-state crimes. Yet, as the specialized task force prepared to shift its focus from the desert Southwest to the ultra-wealthy, highly insulated enclaves of Northern California, a new and deeply unsettling technological anomaly began to surface within the forensic data. As cyberanalysts continued their relentless, deep-dive examination of the encrypted Malibu servers, they discovered that Vance's digital security protocols had been updated with alarming frequency during the years 2018 to 2023, a period that corresponded precisely with the global rise of decentralized public blockchains and advanced, AI-driven digital accounting software. The task force realized that a criminal mastermind who possessed the foresight to utilize an industrial snowplow to conceal a domestic homicide in 1993 would inevitably recognize the terrifying potential of modern digital technology to further insulate his dark empire. A specialized team of cryptocurrency forensic analysts and federal forensic accountants was brought into the operation, tasked with tracking a highly complex, multi-layered pipeline of digital assets that Vance had quietly established under a network of automated smart contracts and anonymous digital wallets. What they uncovered was a financial ghost machine designed to outlive the physical corporations he controlled. Arthur Vance had not merely laundered his stolen wealth through traditional offshore banks. He had converted tens of millions of dollars from his television production profits into highly untraceable, privacy-centric digital currencies, establishing a massive, automated legal defense and counterintelligence trust fund that was programmed to execute specific, devastating financial counterstrikes the moment his biological metrics or digital activity flagged an unexpected anomaly. This meant that even from inside his high-security federal cell, Arthur Vance was still actively attempting to control the narrative, utilizing a dark web financial network to fund private digital espionage campaigns against the very prosecutors, detectives, and forensic scientists who had brought him down. The task force discovered that between the months of his televised arrest and the summer of 2026, over $300,000 in automated digital payments had been distributed to anonymous black hat hacking syndicates operating out of Eastern Europe and Southeast Asia. The objectives of these coordinated digital strikes were terrifyingly precise: to infiltrate the secure cloud servers of the Detroit Cold Case Unit, to corrupt the genetic sequencing databases that held the DNA profiles of his victims, and to systematically dox and intimidate the surviving family members of Clara Vance, Elena Rostova, and the other missing women who had broken their silence. The discovery of this ongoing, post-arrest digital campaign sent a shockwave through the federal judicial system, forcing the immediate implementation of unprecedented cybersecurity protocols and the complete isolation of the evidence locker from all external network connections. Investigators realized that Arthur Vance's pathology was not a static historical relic. It was an active, evolving threat that was leveraging the cutting-edge technology of the 21st century to wage a silent, desperate war against the concept of objective truth. The lead federal prosecutor, realizing that traditional legal measures were insufficient to contain a narcissist with an automated digital empire, initiated a high-stakes emergency filing to permanently seize and neutralize the decentralized digital nodes that hosted Vance's dark web trust, striking a decisive blow against his final, invisible line of defense. Meanwhile, the spatial temporal profiling team had expanded their physical investigation into the rugged, isolated coastal terrain of Mendocino County in Northern California, a region known for its dense redwood forests, treacherous cliffs, and vast expanses of private land that had long served as a sanctuary for individuals seeking absolute isolation. In 1998, long before he became a household name on reality television, Arthur Pendleton had purchased a sprawling, 400-acre timber estate in this remote area, claiming he intended to build an exclusive, off-grid eco-resort for Hollywood elites. The property had remained largely undeveloped, heavily guarded by automated security gates and motion-activated surveillance systems that Arthur had personally installed, completely closed off to the local community and local law enforcement for nearly 3 decades. The task force's behavioral analysts, cross-referencing Vance's private travel logs with the regional databases of unsolved missing persons, flagged a terrifying correlation that drew them directly to the coastal estate. In the summer of 1999, a 23-year-old seasonal park ranger and environmental activist named Chloe DuBois had been leading a grassroots campaign to investigate illegal timber, harvesting, and unauthorized environmental grading on private lands bordering the Vance estate. According to her archived personal journals and field notes, Chloe had documented multiple instances of heavy construction equipment operating deep within the interior of Arthur's property in the dead of night, noting that the company-owned utility vehicles bore the distinct markings of his Los Angeles development firm. Just days after she filed an official complaint with a county zoning board requesting an administrative inspection of the estate, Chloe vanished without a trace, her patrol vehicle found abandoned on a remote fire road with her radio equipment smashed and her GPS logging device completely removed. The logistical challenge of searching a 400-acre wilderness area composed of dense forest, rugged ravines, and unstable, shifting earth forced the federal government to deploy the most advanced military-grade terrain mapping technology available. In July 2026, Operation Foundation Stone transitioned into its most challenging phase, utilizing low-altitude surveillance aircraft equipped with airborne LiDAR, light detection, and ranging, systems capable of penetrating the thick forest canopy to create a highly precise, three-dimensional model of the underlying ground surface. The LiDAR data revealed a series of highly anomalous, unnatural terrain depressions and hidden structural clearings deep within the heart of the Redwood Grove, areas where the earth had been heavily excavated, reinforced with industrial retaining walls, and subsequently covered with thick layers of topsoil and mature vegetation to mimic the natural landscape. A heavily equipped forensic search team, composed of federal agents, cadaver dogs, and forensic archaeologists, mobilized at the remote site, carving a path through the dense undergrowth to reach the coordinates flagged by the airborne sensors. The atmosphere inside the ancient Redwood Grove was heavy, suffocatingly quiet, the towering trees standing as silent witnesses to a decades-old secret. For 4 days, the search teams methodically excavated the target zones, their ground-penetrating radar units cutting through the dense matrix of roots and soil until they struck a large, subterranean structure buried 6 feet beneath the forest floor. It was a heavily reinforced, military-grade concrete bunker, a structure that did not appear on any official building permits or county land surveys, constructed under Arthur Vance's direct, personal supervision during the dark summer of 1999. When the heavy steel hatch of the bunker was finally breached by tactical engineers using hydraulic cutting tools, the interior environment revealed a sickeningly calculated space designed for long-term confinement and structural concealment. Inside the main chamber, beneath a series of historical architectural blueprints and obsolete survey equipment, investigators discovered the preserved personal effects, uniform badges, and skeletal remains of Chloe Dubois. The forensic examination of the recovery site confirmed that she had been subjected to the exact same signature method of manual strangulation that had defined every single one of Arthur Vance's crimes, providing the definitive, undeniable proof that the Timber Estate was not a visionary eco-resort, but a private, highly secure hunting ground and graveyard for a monster who believed he was completely above the law. The exposure of the Mendocino bunker and the recovery of a 6th victim shattered the final remnants of public debate surrounding the true nature of the former reality television star. The narrative had completely transcended the boundaries of traditional true crime media, transforming into a profound, national exploration of structural sociopathy in the modern age. The public began to realize that Arthur Vance had spent his entire life actively manipulating the physical, legal, and digital infrastructure of the United States to build a monument to his own survival, using his immense wealth and celebrity status to blind society to the trail of destruction he left behind. Every single home he had renovated, every community project he had championed, and every single episode of Restoring the Ruins was now permanently stained by the realization that he was an apex predator who viewed the entire world as a grid of potential hiding places. Back within the stark, concrete confines of the Federal Administrative Segregation Facility, Arthur Vance's psychological infrastructure was facing complete, irreversible collapse. The automated digital trust fund he had built to sabotage the prosecution had been systematically dismantled by federal cyber agencies, his hidden dark web nodes taken offline, and his financial assets completely frozen, leaving him entirely dependent on a court-appointed public defender. During a high-stakes, closed-door confrontation on August 12, 2026, federal investigators placed the three-dimensional LiDAR maps of his Redwood estate and the forensic photographs of the hidden concrete bunker directly onto the stainless steel table before him. Arthur Vance stared at the images of the ancient trees and the broken steel hatch, his eyes devoid of the arrogant, calculated spark that had once captivated millions of viewers, his breathing heavy and erratic as he finally realized that his absolute control over his environment had been permanently and completely destroyed. The legacy of the Detroit 1993 cold case stood as a monumental, historic victory for the modern integration of forensic science, cyberintelligence, and unyielding investigative determination. The pursuit that had begun in the freezing dark of a forgotten Michigan winter had successfully tracked a killer across decades, states, and technological eras, proving that the light of truth will always find a way to cut through the most sophisticated networks of deception. As the final legal filings were processed and the multi-jurisdictional trials moved toward their inevitable conclusion, the voices of Clara, Elena, Sarah, Maya, Diana, and Chloe echoed together with absolute, historical permanence. They were no longer the silent victims of a forgotten past. They were the ultimate architects of their killer's destruction, their memory forever vindicated by a justice system that refused to forget, and a truth that no amount of poured concrete or digital manipulation could ever bury. By the late autumn of 2026, the federal omnibus prosecution against Arthur Vance had evolved into an absolute judicial juggernaut, completely rewriting the history of multi-jurisdictional criminal enforcement in the United States. With 6 confirmed victims recovered from the concrete foundations of urban high-rises, desert plazas, and remote redwood bunkers, the joint FBI and Detroit Cold Case Task Force had successfully dismantled the physical and digital architecture of his empire. Yet, as the legal machinery prepared for the grand opening arguments of the federal trial in Detroit, a final, deeply terrifying frontier of Vance's history began to materialize. Investigators realized that the ultimate mystery lay not within the geographic coordinates of his construction projects, but in the dark, silent voids of his early life before the fateful blizzard of November 1993. The Behavioral Profiling Unit began to ask a question that threatened to shatter the foundational timeline of the entire case. Was Clara Vance truly the first person to discover the monster behind the mask? Or was her brutal murder merely the graduation piece of a predator who had been practicing the art of perfect concealment for over a decade? To answer this profound, disturbing question, a specialized team of cold case detectives and forensic historians was dispatched to the industrial Rust Belt town of Flint, Michigan, where Arthur Vance had spent his formative years long before he established himself as the golden boy of the Detroit aristocracy. Flint in the late 1970s and early 1980s was a city undergoing a violent, agonizing economic contraction, a place where the massive automotive factories were beginning to shutter, leaving behind vast landscapes of abandoned industrial complexes, decaying neighborhoods, and a community drowning in social unrest. It was within this environment of systemic decay that a young, intensely ambitious Arthur Vance first learned the trade of structural demolition and masonry from his father, a ruthless, hard-drinking contractor who taught his son that the built environment was something to be manipulated, dominated, and used as a tool for personal profit. The task force initiated a comprehensive, historic audit of unresolved missing persons files, unexplained drownings, and mysterious disappearances from the Genesee County Police archives covering the years 1978 to 1985. What they uncovered was a chilling, localized pattern of anomalies that completely reframed Arthur Vance's psychological development. During his late teens and early 20s, while he was working as a junior site supervisor for his family's demolition firm, Arthur had been granted unfettered, late-night access to dozens of abandoned commercial properties, historic theaters, and deep subterranean utility tunnels that were scheduled to be demolished or filled with industrial aggregate stone to make way for new urban renewal projects. He was a young man operating in the absolute shadows of a dying city, possessing the specialized knowledge, the heavy machinery, and the legal authority to manipulate the physical landscape without drawing a single glance from a hollowed-out local police force. The first historic case that caught the attention of federal investigators was the disappearance of 17-year-old high school student Kimberly Hayes in October 1981. Kimberly was an exceptionally bright, popular young artist who lived just 3 blocks from the Vance family construction yard and frequently walked past the demolition sites on her way home from school. According to archived police interviews with her surviving classmates, Kimberly had recently started expressing intense discomfort regarding a handsome, older construction supervisor who had been relentlessly tracking her movements from the cabin of a heavy-duty corporate utility truck, offering her rides and showing up at the local diner where she studied. On the rainy night of October 24, 1981, Kimberly walked out of a high school football game into the autumn chill and completely vanished from the face of the earth, leaving behind no footprints, no forensic evidence, and a community permanently scarred by the sudden loss. At the time, the local investigation was a complete failure, crippled by the chaotic economic collapse of the city and a total lack of specialized forensic technology. The original detectives had briefly questioned the young Arthur Vance, but his polished demeanor, his family's political influence within the city's redevelopment boards, and his ironclad alibi, provided by his father, who claimed they were conducting an emergency late-night structural stabilization at an old automotive foundry, allowed him to slip through the dragnet without a second glance. However, when the modern cold case task force utilized advanced AI-driven document analysis to cross-reference the historical demolition permits signed by the Vance firm against the specific timeline of Kimberly's disappearance, they made a sickening discovery. The foundation of the old automotive foundry had been permanently filled with over 400 tons of rapid-setting industrial concrete exactly 6 hours after Kimberly was last seen alive. The realization that Arthur Vance's signature methodology, the precise utilization of structural concrete and institutional demolition to entomb his victims, had been perfected when he was barely 20 years old, sent a wave of absolute horror through the federal prosecution team. It meant that the entire timeline of his life had to be viewed through a radically different, far more sinister lens. He was not a man who was driven to a single act of madness by a domestic dispute with his wife in 1993. He was an active, highly disciplined serial predator who had spent his entire adult existence weaponizing the physical infrastructure of the state of Michigan to build a hidden empire of death, using his immense wealth and eventual television fame to hide a legacy that began in the ruins of a dying industrial town. In November 2026, Operation Foundation Stone executed its final, most emotionally charged forensic intervention, returning to the now-abandoned industrial sector of Flint with an unprecedented deployment of heavy excavation machinery, structural engineering teams, and deep subsurface imaging radar. The logistical scale of the operation was staggering, drawing national media networks who realized that this final search represented the definitive origin story of America's most deceptive celebrity killer. For 7 days, heavy industrial diamond core drills tore through layers of reinforced steel and decades of industrial waste, cutting down to the primary foundation level of the old foundry that had been sealed under Arthur's supervision 45 years earlier. On the 8th night of the excavation, deep within the primary load-bearing pillar that once supported the factory's main assembly line, the ground-penetrating radar flagged an unmistakable, density-shifting structural void that perfectly matched the geometric patterns discovered in his subsequent coast-to-coast graveyards. Forensic anthropologists worked through the freezing night, utilizing delicate hand tools to clear away the ancient aggregate stone until they finally breached the dark, airtight chamber. Inside that hidden vault, investigators recovered the preserved personal effects, a distinctive silver high school ring, and the skeletal remains of Kimberly Hayes. The forensic examination confirmed that she had been subjected to the exact same signature method of manual strangulation that would later claim the lives of Clara Vance in Detroit, Elena Rostova in Los Angeles, and the other women across the country, providing the definitive, historical bookend to a 45-year reign of terror. The exposure of the Flint recovery site and the identification of a 7th victim completely obliterated the final remnants of Arthur Vance's legal defense strategy. His high-priced defense team realized the absolute impossibility of fighting a 45-year physical pipeline of matching forensic evidence, formally withdrew their pending motions to challenge the genetic genealogy and spatial temporal data. The public's revulsion reached an unprecedented crescendo as millions of people who had watched him on Restoring the Ruins had to come to terms with the terrifying reality that the charismatic man they had celebrated as a master of modern renewal was a monster whose criminal career began before many of his viewers were even born. Back inside the absolute isolation of the Federal Administrative Segregation Facility, the psychological deconstruction of Arthur Vance was absolute. Stripped of his celebrity status, his automated digital wealth, and the protective myth of his corporate identity, he sat in the stark, unyielding glare of his cell as a hollow monument to his own spectacular defeat. During a final, high-stakes deposition on November 14, 2026, exactly 33 years to the day since the blizzard that took Clara Vance, federal prosecutors placed the silver high school ring of Kimberly Hayes directly onto the stainless steel table before him. Arthur Vance stared at the small, tarnished piece of metal, his eyes completely devoid of the smooth, calculating arrogance that had defined his public life, his chest heaving as he finally realized that the modern world had stripped away every single layer of concrete he had ever poured, leaving him completely exposed under the eternal, unyielding light of truth. The legacy of the Detroit 1993 cold case had officially transcended the boundaries of traditional criminal history, standing as a monumental, permanent testament to the absolute endurance of investigative science and the unyielding refusal of the law to let time erase the memory of the dead. The pursuit that had begun in the freezing dark of a forgotten Palmer Woods whiteout had successfully illuminated a dark, coast-to-coast highway of deception, tracking a monster from the hidden ruins of his youth to the brightest lights of Hollywood fame. As the sun set over the Detroit River, casting a long, familiar shadow across the historic brick facades of the city, the voices of Clara, Elena, Sarah, Maya, Diana, Chloe, and Kimberly echoed together with absolute, permanent clarity. They were no longer lost names in a forgotten filing cabinet. They were the ultimate architects of their killer's destruction, their memory forever vindicated by a justice system that refused to forget, and a truth that no amount of poured concrete could ever bury. The recovery of Kimberly Hayes from the deep industrial foundations of Flint, Michigan, brought the multi-jurisdictional task force to the absolute edge of a dark, 45-year structural labyrinth. By the freezing winter of 2026, the legal machinery of the United States federal government had constructed an unassailable fortress of physical, digital, and spatial temporal evidence against Arthur Vance. The grand narrative of the silver-tongued celebrity contractor who specialized in unearthing hidden spaces while concealing a nationwide graveyard within his own building foundations had reached its final, absolute destination. Yet, before the first juror could take their seat in the Federal District Court of Detroit, the prosecution team, working alongside the Bureau of Prisons and the FBI's Behavioral Intelligence Unit, understood that the ultimate closure of this historic cold case required a final, definitive confrontation. They needed to secure not just a string of technical convictions, but a comprehensive, permanent psychological surrender from a man who had spent his entire life treating the truth as a structural element to be manipulated, buried, and paved over. The logistics of this final legal phase required unprecedented security and absolute secrecy. Arthur Vance, now a completely broken, graying monument to his own shattered hubris, was transported under heavy federal marshal escort from the Administrative Segregation Unit to the high-security federal courthouse in downtown Detroit. The streets outside the building were lined with television broadcast trucks, international journalists, and hundreds of quiet citizens holding candles, a striking, solemn contrast to the chaotic, roaring media circus that had defined his spectacular arrest on live reality television just over a year prior. Inside the secure, wood-paneled conference room adjacent to the main courtroom, the primary investigators, including the modern successors of Detective Marcus Miller, sat across the stainless steel table from the man who had haunted the collective conscience of 3 generations of Michigan law enforcement. The objective of the deposition was the formal execution of a comprehensive, global plea agreement, a legal document that would strip Arthur Vance of any remaining right to appeal, ensure his permanent incarceration in an ultra-maximum security facility without the slightest possibility of parole, and mandate the total forfeiture of his remaining hidden assets to establish an endowment for the families of his victims. In exchange for avoiding the federal death penalty, Vance was required to go on the record, under the merciless glare of forensic video cameras, and walk the task force through the precise, mechanical reality of every single homicide he had committed from 1981 to 2014. The atmosphere inside the room was suffocatingly tense, the quiet hum of the high-definition recording equipment filling the silence as the federal prosecutor adjusted the microphone and commanded the former television icon to state his true name for the historical record. For the first few minutes, the old habits of the master manipulator attempted to resurface. Arthur Vance looked at the lens of the video camera, his posture straightening slightly, his voice attempting to locate the smooth, resonant, authoritative cadence that had once charmed 40 million weekly viewers on Restoring the Ruins. He tried to speak of his crimes as structural necessities, framing his survival on the run as a testament to his unique intellect and his visionary understanding of the built environment. But the lead FBI profiler brutally cut him off, slamming a massive, leather-bound binder onto the metal table, a document containing the definitive forensic profiles, the genetic sequences, the architectural blueprints, and the photographs of the 7 recovered women: Kimberly, Clara, Linda, Diana, Elena, Sarah, and Maya. The illusion of the artistic builder was instantly shattered, replaced by the ugly, unvarnished reality of an aging, systematic killer who had run completely out of concrete, out of time, and out of lies. With his hands trembling inside his heavy iron restraints, Arthur Vance finally began to speak the truth, his voice dropping to a cold, flat, chillingly clinical whisper that sent a shudder through the seasoned detectives recording his words. He started with the winter night of November 14, 1993, detailing the suffocating silence of the Palmer Woods mansion as the blizzard cut off the power lines. He described with terrifying precision how he had used his hands to silence Clara's voice when she threatened to expose his fraudulent real estate empire, and how the arrival of the historic storm was the exact catalyst he needed to transform a sudden act of domestic violence into a masterfully planned execution. He walked the investigators through the freezing mechanics of plowing his pickup truck through the deserted, snow-choked streets of Detroit, loading the industrial barrel onto the abandoned Delray Pier, and watching it sink into the black, churning waters of the river, confident that the elements would preserve his secret forever. From there, the confession flowed like a dark, toxic river across the geography of the American highway system. Vance detailed the agonizing, high-stress summer of 1994 spent in the rundown motels of Gary, Indiana, explaining how his profound rage at losing his high-society lifestyle turned him into an active predator along the interstate corridors, leading to the opportunistic abduction and murder of Linda Cooper. He described his arrival in Las Vegas in 1995, detailing how he used the high-volume casino operations to wash the blood money from Clara's accounts, and how he had ruthlessly choked the life out of Diana Mercer when her private background check threatened to expose his fraudulent Panamanian shell companies before the escrow closed. One by one, he mapped the bones within his architecture, detailing the construction of the sub-basement vault in Los Angeles for Elena Rostova, the support pillars in Portland for Sarah Jenkins and Maya Lin, and the reinforced concrete bunker deep within the Mendocino Redwoods for Chloe Dubois. The physical description of his methods was deeply chilling, but it was his complete lack of human empathy, his clinical, narcissistic detachment, that horrified the task force the most. Vance didn't view his victims as human beings with families, dreams, and futures. He viewed them entirely as structural anomalies, minor design flaws in the grand blueprint of his personal success that had to be permanently sealed away to protect the structural integrity of his public image. He admitted that every time he stood before the television cameras for Restoring the Ruins, smiling at the audience while standing on a freshly poured concrete floor, he felt an intense, godlike rush of absolute superiority. He believed he had constructed the ultimate, perfect joke on modern society, hiding the horrific evidence of his true nature within the very structures people were praising him for restoring. When the final signature was inked onto the master plea agreement and the recording cameras were turned off, a profound, exhausting silence fell over the courthouse. The legal battle that had spanned 33 years, consumed the careers of dozens of detectives, and driven families to the brink of absolute despair was officially, permanently over. Arthur Vance was led out of the room in heavy chains, his eyes staring blankly at the polished linoleum floor, completely stripped of his name, his fame, his wealth, and his dignity. He was transferred immediately to a permanent, subterranean cell at the Federal Supermax facility in Florence, Colorado, a place composed entirely of reinforced concrete and solid rock, an ironic, inescapable tomb where he would spend the remainder of his natural life completely cut off from the light, the cameras, and the public whose trust he had so violently betrayed. The immediate aftermath of the final confession brought an overwhelming, historic wave of catharsis and emotional release to the city of Detroit and the communities across the country that had lived in the long shadow of his crimes. The Palmer Woods Mansion, the Las Vegas Plaza, the Portland waterfront, and the Mendocino Timber Estate were no longer viewed as monuments to a celebrity contractor's legacy. They were officially reconsecrated as permanent historic sites of memory and justice, their physical spaces dedicated to honoring the lives of the 7 brilliant women who had refused to let their killer win. The television network that broadcasted his show issued a final, profound public apology, establishing a multi-million-dollar foundation dedicated to funding advanced forensic genetic genealogy research for unsolved cold cases across the globe, ensuring that his dark legacy would inadvertently provide the tools to catch future predators. As the deep winter of 2026 settled over the Great Lakes, casting a thick, familiar blanket of white snow across the historic streets of Palmer Woods and the dark, flowing waters of the Detroit River, the narrative of this legendary cold case finally reached its absolute, peaceful conclusion. The snows could no longer hide the truth, the concrete could no longer hold the dead, and the digital screens could no longer protect the monster. The voices of Kimberly, Clara, Linda, Diana, Elena, Sarah, and Maya had broken through decades of deception, corruption, and media manipulation, their memories permanently vindicated by the relentless, unyielding march of forensic science. The lights had been turned off, the cameras had been packed away, and the final credits had rolled on the life of Arthur Vance, leaving behind a timeless, monumental testament to the world that justice does not decay, does not forget, and will always find a way to tear down the screen to claim its absolute, permanent victory. The steel gates of the Federal Supermax facility in Florence, Colorado, had slammed shut behind the nameless inmate once known as Arthur Vance, but the final, structural echoes of his 45-year deception were still vibrating through the institutional foundations of the American legal and cultural landscape. By the early months of 2027, the physical hunt for his victims had reached its definitive conclusion, and the legal system had extracted its absolute pound of flesh through an unappealable, global plea agreement. Yet, inside the secure research divisions of the FBI's Academy at Quantico and the academic halls of modern forensic psychology, a final, monumental post-mortem operation was initiated. This was not a search for more hidden graves or buried corporate ledgers. It was a deep, unprecedented behavioral autopsy designed to dissect the systemic blind spots that allowed an apex sociopath to weaponize the modern entertainment industry,